Welcome to this short presentation about the EU. My name is Hagen Schotzauer.
And I'm Ingo.
We're policy analysts at the European office of FiscalNote, which is a global technology and media company that provides policy data, news, analytics, and workflow tools to help organizations assess and act on risk and opportunity. Questions by customers and colleagues often revolve around the peculiar nature of the EU, originally an international organization that increasingly behaves like a state. How is that to be understood in policymaking? And since it's our job here in Europe to make EU policymaking accessible to people from all over the globe, we have decided to make this presentation. So for this presentation, we're going to discuss what the EU is, what it does, and to illustrate what the institution of the EU, we're going to compare EU institutions to US institutions. First off, the conclusion should be the EU is institutionally a bit of a mess, as it was conceived as this grand project, but it was first implemented small and then grew organically. For that, we quickly need to look back at the origins of the EU. The origin story of the EU is a little bit similar to that of Bane in Batman, in that the EU was molded in the dark. In the aftermath of the Second World War, Europe needed to be rebuilt, and differences should in the future be solved peacefully. As one of the founding fathers of the EU, Robert Schuman, put it, Europe will not be made all at once or according to a single plan. It will be built through concrete achievements which first create a de facto solidarity. As you can probably imagine, there was not much trust or solidarity to go around after the Second World War, especially between France and Germany, for example, or then in the Cold War between the East and the West. So first, a small step needed to be taken. So the very beginning of the EU was in the Treaty of Paris, where the idea was to merge together the steel and coal production of Germany and France as a first step. This was to be done on the basis of free trade. Then we have a lot of revisions of the treaties. They're all international law treaties between a number of states. And we're not going to talk about all of them. But then the last iteration is the Lisbon Treaty in 2009, where all the different organizations, the different processes and organizations were put together in one comprehensive treaty. So during each step, national and institutional interests would influence the shape of the EU. They would try to solve previous problems, but in turn create new problems and unintended consequences. The result is that the EU competences, so the policy areas in which the EU legislates, organically grew. It was often influenced by necessity, but then again kept in check by member states, which jealously kept the competences they have and the sovereignty they have by themselves. So at the moment, we have the EU competences, that's the exclusive competence the EU has, shared competences, shared between member states and the EU, and national supporting and coordinating competences, where the EU is active, but doesn't legislate over member states. The exclusive competences are those competences where only the EU has the ability to legislate. It would create problems if, for example, in the trade area, because the EU is mostly a trade bloc, would also legislate. Shared competences are primarily with the member states. So, for example, in the internal market or social policy, member states will be able to make laws. However, in a specific field, a specific policy field, the EU starts to legislate, this precludes member states from legislating themselves, because then you would get into conflict with EU law. And finally, the national supporting and coordinating competences, the EU only has the ability to coordinate or formulate best practices, for example. Similar to the competences, the member states of the EU have grown organically. It started with 6 countries: Germany, France, Italy, and the Benelux countries. The French and German coal and steel productions were supposed to be intertwined, and this was to be done on the basis of free trade between these countries. As free trade creates a lot of wealth, other countries wanted to join the EU as well. And so slowly the EU has grown over Europe. After, as the EU has grown, as did its political clout on the international stage, which created another point of attraction for other countries to join the EU and pool their resources and pool their influences together. So at the moment, the EU covers most of Europe. However, there are some notable exceptions. In the West, that's Iceland, Norway, and Switzerland, who are not part of the EU. And then we have big countries like Russia and Turkey, as well as some Eastern European countries and the Balkans that are not part of it. Most of these countries are in different stages of accession talks, but those can take years or maybe even decades. A very interesting development is Brexit. We have 28 member states at the moment, but one of the member states has voted for the very first time in the history of the EU to leave the trading and political bloc of the EU. As you are watching this from the future, Brexit might have already happened, but at the moment it's been postponed 3 times and is now planned for the beginning of 2020. My policy area here is institutional, and I'm following this very closely because this will obviously have very big institutional implications. And so we're writing daily analysis on the developments and the outcome of this whole Brexit process. And we will also follow the future relationship between the UK and the EU. So from member states, we're now having a smooth segue into the EU institutions, because 2 of the institutions are basically the EU member states who are influencing these institutions. So for this, please take it away.
Thank you, Hagen. So as Hagen said, let's now look into the institutions and what is the current landscape of the EU at this point. So first of all, we will look into the European Council. So the European Council is tasked with defining the EU's overall political direction and priorities. It is composed of 28 heads of states and governments, and is led by a president whose role is to chair the meetings and drive its work. The European Council meets in Brussels at least twice a year, usually in spring and in the fall. However, there can be also extraordinary meetings, as it has previously happened when it comes to Eurozone crisis or Brexit. Unlike other major institutions, which we will talk about in a bit, the European Council is purely political institution and they do not legislate. So now let's check out the 3 institutions that are actually involved in the legislative process. So the first one is the European Commission, who is politically independent executive branch of the EU. Their main responsibility is to draw up legislative proposals. So once the Commission puts forward a legislative proposal, it will be sent to the European Parliament and the Council to debate and then accept or reject. When I say Council, I do not mean that what we previously talked about, the European Council, but actually the Council of the European Union, which we will talk in a moment. So once the European Commission has tabled the new legislation, it is also expected the Commission has the best interest of its citizens at heart, and they aim to solve issues that cannot be dealt with effectively at the national level. The Commission is also the guardian of the treaties, and this means that the Commission works with the Court of Justice to ensure that the EU law is uniformly applied in all of its member states. This also gives the Commission the power to sanction member states if necessary. And finally, the Commission is made up of 28 commissioners, with 1 from each member state, and the Commission is headed by a president. The commissioners have to be neutral, and they do not make decisions based on their national interests. And now to the second council. So this is the Council of the European Union, who is the co-legislator together with the European Parliament. Overall, the Council negotiates, adopts EU laws, coordinates member state policies, develops EU common foreign and security policy, and also adopts the EU budget. Currently, there are 10 configurations which meet regularly. For example, if the Commission submits a proposal in the area of environment, then all the environment ministers would come together to discuss this proposal. The presidency of the Council is rotated every 6 months between member states and currently being held by Finland. The role of the presidency is to chair the meetings and organize the work of the Council. The member state holding the presidency also defines priorities for the Council to address, So currently, for example, Finland's priorities are sustainability, rule of law, and more competitive and socially inclusive EU. I think here to really take into account is that different from the Commission, the Council ministers are representing national interests. So the last institution we will look into is the European Parliament, who is a co-legislator together with the Council of the European Union. The Parliament is expected to be the voice of the European citizens because the citizens are the ones who elect the members. So currently we have 751 members. However, once Brexit happens, there will be 705 seats. The Parliament is composed of 20 committees that cover a wide range of policy areas. So, for example, when the Commission presents a proposal in the field of environment, it would go to the Committee on Environment, similarly as it would go to the environment ministers in the Council. The Parliament's term is 5 years, and the last elections we actually had now this year in May. Historically, the European Parliament has had less power than the Council and the Commission. However, as they are now a co-legislator with the Council, their powers have increased, and in the future it is not expected to decrease, rather the opposite. So now that we understand all of the institutions better, we can take a quick look at the decision-making process and how the legislators, so the Commission, the Council of the European Union, and the European Parliament interact. So here we have the main decision-making process, which is called the ordinary legislative procedure. While there are other procedures, for example, when it comes to secondary legislation, there are implementing acts and delegated acts, which are more minor and technical changes to EU law. The ordinary legislative procedure is the main way to pass law or introduce new rules in the EU. So first we have the European Commission, the executive power of the EU, who has the rights of initiative, and in most cases this institution will initiate legislation. So they will prepare a proposal, a draft text, and this will be then sent to the European Parliament and the Council to discuss. So when we look at the European Parliament, they receive this text, and it will be sent to the European Parliament's committee that is responsible for this particular policy area. The committee will then appoint a rapporteur who will examine the proposal and propose any amendments. Once the committee stage is completed, it will be sent to the European Parliament's plenary, where all these 751 members will come together, and they will discuss the proposal and finally adopt their version of this text. So in this stage, we already have two versions of the same proposal. In parallel, when the European Parliament gets the text, it will be also sent to the Council of the European Union. The Council will then analyze and discuss the text, and it will go through working party levels as well as ambassadors, and up until when all the ministers come together, and then they will adopt their version of this text. So at this point now we have three versions of the same proposal. Then the institutions will come together and try to find a consensus which sort of version of this text would be the best. These negotiations are called trialogues, and once an interinstitutional agreement is reached, it will be then have to be endorsed both in the European Parliament and the Council. The often case is that they will reach an agreement in the trialogue stage. Sometimes it might take 3 meetings, sometimes 7, but very rarely the three institutions have to proceed to a second reading, or even more rarely to a third one. So now that we have looked at all the main institutions and how the EU works when it comes to its decision making, Hagen will talk about what are the differences between the EU and the US.
Regarding the differences between the EU and the US, we're going to be looking at the different institutions, compare them a little bit, and try to illustrate that how the EU differs from a federal state like the US, for example. So the first institution is the European Parliament, which is most closely resembles the US House of Representatives. But the big difference is that the European Parliament does not have legislative initiative. This is very different from other legislative branches in other states where MPs or members of parliament have the right to introduce legislation as well. European Parliament does amend and then finally is part of the adoption of legislation, but it doesn't introduce it. The second co-legislator is the Council of the European Union. It most closely resembles the United States Senate. Again, it's one of the co-legislator, but the legislative branch in the EU has very limited legislative initiative. The Council of the European Union is important in amending and adopting legislation and the EU budget, but it does not initiate. It's made out of ministers, so it's only accountable to national parliaments, and it's also not static, because if there's an election in government in the EU, then the makeup of the Council of the European Union might change. The working within the Council of the European Union is also very much like an intergovernmental organization where countries represent their own interest, and the politics in this organ is very much based on diplomacy. Since the member states chose to pool their resources and influence in the EU to appear on the world stage, this is also the organ that's very important to international agreements. Treaties and trade agreements would need to be initiated by the Council of the European Union, and they decide its mandate and oversee and approve the process. The last branch is the executive branch, and in my opinion, this is the biggest difference with other states. The European Commission can be most closely compared with the office of the US President and his administration, but the EU Commission is not elected at all. It's appointed by the member states in the European Council, and then these appointments have to be approved by the European Parliament as to give it democratic legitimacy, but we don't elect members of the Commission directly. It doesn't have a lot of responsibilities as a normal head of an executive does. It doesn't command military forces, for example, but what it does have is a very, very big role in EU policymaking, because it's the only legislative organ that actually introduces new legislation, that proposes legislation. So legislative initiative rests solely with the European Commission, and that's a very, very big difference. So as a conclusion, decision-making between the EU and the US, what should you keep in mind when comparing these two entities? Well, so when comparing the EU and the US, there are some very important differences. The EU is a totally new beast on the international stage. It's a hybrid between an international organization like the UN and a federal state like the US. It's based on intergovernmentalism on one part and has federal characteristics on the other hand. As Trina has told you before, it's much more focused on consensus. In the European Council, member states try to find a consensus among themselves, while the European Parliament tries to find a broad political support for legislation. And then during the trilogues, the three organizations try to find a consensus among themselves again. While in the US, it's a much more winner-takes-all majoritarian style of politics. With regards to policy making, in the US, there is a clear hierarchical authority going down the chain of command, while in the EU, there's no clear defined center of authority. It's very dependent on the policy area, how the policy area grew in the history of the EU, as well as the actors and how strongly they fulfill their roles. And even during something like the ordinary legislative procedure, there'd be different centers of authority that are trying to find a consensus finally among themselves. So, Jean, please.
So as a last point in our presentation, we will also quickly talk about what we do here at the FiscalNote Brussels office. So here we follow EU policy very, very carefully, and our team of analysts use a range of tools to monitor the activities of all the institutions that we previously talked about. Not only do we follow legislative measures, including secondary legislation, but also non-legislative files, and every day we identify new developments and analyze them and report the news to our clients. So we use a database which is called EU Issue Tracker, where all of our clients can find the latest developments, but also historical background, what has happened previously with the proposals. One of our key strengths is also warning our clients very, very early of future legislation, and we often spot proposals even 2 or 3 years before the Commission actually presents the text. Every time there's new developments or new proposals emerge, we let our clients know through active alerts, and our team of policy analysts are always happy to answer any follow-up questions or help the clients understand the developments better. We hope that you enjoyed our presentation and understand the EU institutions better now. When it comes to EU, it's always evolving, as Hagen previously said. So I guess we will see how the EU looks like even in a year from now after Brexit, or even in 5 years. If you want to know more what we do here in FiscalNote, we're always happy to get in touch, or you can also visit our website at fiscalnote.com. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.
Bye.